Once entire villages survived without power, without supermarkets, and without help. They didn't Google what to plant or ask how to store food for winter. They already knew. They built cold cellars with their bare hands. They boiled weeds no one plants today. They dried grain in tin pans, beside open fire, scraped crumbs from tablecloths, and smoked meat in clay pots sealed with ash. These weren't backup plans, they were life. And they worked, season after season, year after year. Even when the front lines moved and the skies rained fire. But when the war ended, something else began. Forgetting. These food survival techniques, tested under siege and famine, faded into silence. Not because they failed, but because comfort replaced memory. Today, that memory is needed again. Not for war, but for resilience. The knowledge still exists. It's buried in old fields, forgotten manuals, and the bones of those who once outlasted the impossible. If you believe this wisdom should never vanish again, subscribe now. The lessons ahead were paid for in hunger. Number 1, cold cellar root preservation. The earth itself became the pantry. In regions where frost crippled gardens and snow buried supply routes, peasants needed a method to store root vegetables without spoilage or rot. Cold cellars offered that solution, dug by hand, lined with stone or brick, and sealed against light and heat. These underground chambers, often built beneath cottages or barns, used the soil's natural insulation to maintain a steady temperature just above freezing. This stability protected potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets, and onions from both decay and freezing. 2 killers of winter harvests. Families would layer straw or dry leaves between crops to prevent direct contact and absorb excess moisture. Everything inside was arranged with precision, soft-skinned vegetables like turnips at the top, firmer ones like potatoes below. Ventilation shafts, carved with simple clay pipes or wooden ducts, prevented humidity buildup, keeping the air moving just enough to delay mold. There were no thermometers, no powered cooling systems, only instinct and experience. Peasants learned to check for rot by smell, to feel for cold spots in the stone, and to rotate stock before it turned. Access was controlled. The cellar was not open casually. Each visit let in warm air, risking spoilage. Families rationed their trips, often assigning one person to manage inventory with military discipline. During the harshest months, these underground chambers became the only reason entire households stayed fed. No food arrived by truck. No stores offered help. The cold cellar was the difference between a cooked meal and a boiling pot of water with nothing to add. The construction itself was deliberate. Cellars were usually dug near hillsides or beneath livestock shelters to protect from rain runoff. Thick doors made from salvaged wood were reinforced with iron hinges or rope latches to seal out rodents. In wetter climates, floors were layered with gravel to wick away ground moisture. And despite their simplicity, these cellars were feats of engineering, each one unique to its region, built from whatever material could be spared. In places where building materials ran out, some peasants used clay and hay to form makeshift walls, reinforced with old wagon wheels or metal scraps. Today, we rely on freezers that hum quietly in the background, powered by fragile grids. But back then, a cold cellar didn't need fuel. It didn't need maintenance. It needed knowledge and the patience to use it. In the silence of stone and straw, entire harvests waited through winter. If food security meant digging through frozen earth, would you still be ready? Subscribe to keep real survival alive. Number 2, grain pan, drying racks. Long before vacuum-sealed bags and climate-controlled silos, peasants preserved their grains with little more than fire, metal, and repetition. After the harvest, wheat, oats, and legumes had to be dried quickly, not just to store, but to survive. Moisture was the enemy. Even a few damp kernels could mold and ruin an entire sack. To prevent that, families used flat tin pans placed over wood stoves, stone hearths, or clay ovens to dry their grain by hand. It wasn't efficient and it wasn't fast. But it worked. By turning small batches regularly and monitoring heat with nothing but their skin and instinct, peasants stretched their food through seasons when nothing grew. These pans were salvaged from roofing scraps, broken cookware, or cut-up barrels. The shallower the pan, the better the drying. Grains were spread no more than an inch thick, stirred with wooden spoons, and never left unattended. If the fire burned too hot, the grain would scorch. Too cold and moisture would linger, inviting mildew. There was no automation, only vigilance. Women and older children often rotate shifts, watching the pans, adding wood to the fire, and stirring constantly. In some homes, multiple pans were used at once, balanced on bricks or stones, to create makeshift drying stations. In others, pans were swapped throughout the day in rhythm with cooking, using residual heat to avoid wasting fuel. After drying, the grain was cooled on clothes or flat wooden boards, then funneled into cloth sacks or clay jars lined with paper or straw. Storage locations were chosen carefully, cool, dark, and well ventilated. Nothing was placed directly on the ground. Every batch was marked, every bag rotated, because in wartime you didn't just lose grain. You lost time, labor, and a portion of winter. In some regions, dried lentils and barley were ground into meals or stored whole for soup. In others, peasants used these dried grains as currency to trade for salt, lard, or tobacco. A properly dried harvest wasn't just food. It was leverage. But the method required consistency. Rainy days delayed drying. Sudden humidity forced families to re-dry entire batches. And when fuel ran low, choices had to be made. Cook the meal or dry tomorrow's seed. Yet even in ruin, the system endured. Because it didn't rely on equipment, only discipline. Because even a broken stove could still give heat. And because in a world collapsing around them, peasants found control in a single layer of grain on a rusted metal pan. Could you protect your harvest without machines? Subscribe to preserve the skills that machines replaced. Number 3, rendered fat jars. In wartime kitchens, fat was never thrown away. It was collected, clarified, and sealed, not out of habit, but survival. Butter was rare. Cooking oil was often impossible to find. Meat, when available, came with precious streaks of lard or drippings. Every drop mattered. Peasants developed a system. Every time meat was cooked, the rendered fat was carefully strained through cloth or mesh, then poured into jars, clay, glass, or even metal tins, and stored in cool, dark corners. These jars became the foundation of daily cooking. A spoonful stretched vegetables, a smear revives stale bread. And in deep winter, when fuel was low and calories ran thin, it could mean the difference between nourishment and mere sustenance. The process was disciplined. Only clean fat was saved. Bits of meat or seasoning were filtered out to prevent spoilage. Once cooled, the fat solidified into a pale, creamy layer. Sometimes white, sometimes yellow, depending on the source. Pork fat was common. Goose or duck fat was prized. Even the grease skimmed from boiled bones had value. In some regions, fat was stored in multiple jars, one for frying, one for baking, and one mixed with salt or herbs for preserving cooked meats. These jars were labeled, rotated, and guarded like ration books. A single crack in the seal could invite rot or mold. But when kept airtight, some fat jars lasted weeks, even months. This stored fat wasn't just a cooking aid. It became a preservation method, Pieces of cooked meat were sometimes submerged in fat and sealed, a process known for centuries in rural Europe. Without refrigeration, this method extended shelf life dramatically. A small pot of pork, packed tightly in cooled lard, could remain safe to eat well beyond the slaughter date. Peasants buried these jars in cold cellars or tucked them into clay shelves behind stoves, where temperature fluctuations were minimal. But like every wartime technique, it came with risks. Fat went rancid if contaminated. Cleanliness was non-negotiable, and as hunger deepened, jars disappeared faster than they could be filled. Some families rationed their fat by the spoon, 1 per meal, no more. Others bartered fat for flour, soap, or medicine. In the darkest months, a half-full jar was a measure of wealth, willpower, and restraint. There were no additives, no expiration dates, just rendered fat, stored in silence, waiting to keep the family fed 1 spoonful at a time. Would you guard kitchen grease like treasure? Subscribe to learn what real preservation costs. Section 4. Wild nettle. Harvesting. When gardens failed and fields froze solid, peasants turned to what others ignored, the weeds. Among the most vital was the stinging nettle, a plant dismissed in peace, but hunted in war. It grew wild along fences, ditches, and forest edges. Its sting was sharp, its appearance unwanted, yet it held what hungry families needed most: iron, calcium, and protein. At a time when ration books offered barely enough to survive, nettles became a critical green vegetable, harvested in secret, handled with care, and boiled into soups, teas, or mash. The harvesting process demanded precision. Thick gloves or folded rags were used to pluck the young leaves before flowering, when nutrients were highest and bitterness low. Older leaves were avoided. Their fibers became tough and potentially irritating. Peasants filled sacks, aprons, or baskets with caution, knowing that even small contact could burn skin. Back at home, the leaves were washed repeatedly in cold water to remove grit and insects, then plunged into boiling pots to neutralize the sting. Once wilted, nettles could be mashed like spinach, mixed with flour for dumplings, or stirred into broth with dried onion and leftover fat. It wasn't gourmet. It was green. And during certain weeks, it was all they had. In many regions, wild greens like nettles extended the hunger season, that brutal window between the end of stored winter food and the beginning of the spring harvest. For poorer households, especially those without livestock or land, this window could mean real starvation. Nettle harvesting bought them time. Children were taught how to recognize the plant by shape, texture, and location. Some families kept dried nettles in cloth sacks for later use, though fresh leaves held more value. Others traded bunches at informal markets, exchanged not for money, but for salt, soap, or matches. It was a survival currency drawn from the soil's forgotten edges. Still, it had limits. Nettles didn't grow everywhere. Heavy snow buried them. Overharvesting stripped the land. And a poor harvest meant that entire neighborhoods lost access to this wild lifeline. But where they grew strong, persistent, self-replicating, and impossible to fully erase, like the peasants themselves. There were no labels, no measuring spoons, no recipe books. Just scorched pots, gloved hands, and the knowledge that something green still grew, even when everything else was dying. If survival meant boiling weeds to feed your family, would you do it? Subscribe to uncover what real hunger teaches. Number 5, breadcrumb. Collecting cloths. In wartime homes, bread wasn't just food, it was survival in crust form. Every loaf was rationed, every slice divided with care, and every crumb counted. But what fell wasn't lost. Peasant families lined their tables with clothes not for decoration, but for preservation. These tightly woven sheets caught the fragments, the crust flakes, the torn edges, the tiny grains that slipped through fingers. At the end of each meal, the cloth was lifted, shaken gently, and the crumbs collected into tins, jars, or sacks. Nothing was wasted, nothing forgotten. Over days, these crumbs added up, enough to form dumplings, thicken soup, or bind vegetable patties. Some were mixed with dried herbs and boiling water to form porridge. Others were fried in lard for a rare, rich garnish. In households where meat was scarce and flour ran low, these crumbs replaced what couldn't be bought. They extended recipes, they filled their stomachs, they transformed scarcity into something that, for a few minutes, resembled a meal. The cloth itself mattered. Coarse enough to catch crumbs, but tight enough to prevent loss. Old flour sacks, curtain scraps, or worn aprons were commonly repurposed. Some families kept separate clothes for different types of bread: rye, barley, wheat, depending on what was available that week. Cloths were stored dry and clean, usually folded into wooden drawers, or hung behind stoves to keep moisture away. If mold appeared, the crumbs were discarded without hesitation. Food was precious, but sickness was unforgiving. Children were taught the ritual early. Shake the cloth, scrape the crumbs, never brush them to the floor. During the harshest months, these habits became sacred. A day's worth of crumbs might be all that stood between a thin broth and something solid. In some regions, crumbs were traded. A tin exchanged for a ladle of soup, or saved to bake a crusty loaf when flour could be found. They weren't just leftovers. They were currency in the economy of hunger. But even this method had its limits. Rainy days brought dampness. Carelessness ruined collection. And in the chaos of air raids or evacuations, clothes were sometimes forgotten or burned with the fuel. Yet the principle endured. Waste nothing. Save everything. Because in a world where bread came by ration, the crumbs became a quiet form of resistance against hunger, against surrender, and against the slow erosion of dignity. Would you collect what others throw away to keep your family alive? Subscribe to reclaim the wisdom carved into every crumb. Number 6, rainwater barrel. Catchments. When wells dried or froze, and pumps fell silent under snow, peasants turned upward to the sky itself. Rainwater, once overlooked, became a vital resource. Every roof, every gutter, every slope of sheet metal became part of a catchment system. At the heart of it was a single object: the barrel. Wooden, metal, or salvaged from discarded storage drums. These barrels were positioned with precision beneath roof runoff to catch every drop. They were not just for drinking, though sometimes they were. They served gardens, livestock, laundry, and in desperate times, even cooking. The system was rugged, but deliberate. Gutters were fashioned from bent tin, clay tiles, or bamboo halves. Barrels were elevated slightly off the ground using bricks or stone to reduce soil contamination. A cloth or mesh was often stretched over the opening, not for aesthetics, but to keep out leaves, birds, and insects. After each rainfall, the barrel's top was sealed to prevent stagnation and limit exposure. In colder months, they were wrapped with straw, cloth, or bark to prevent freezing and cracking. Every detail mattered. This wasn't convenient. It was a calculation. One heavy rain could fill multiple barrels, giving a family weeks of gray water for cleaning and crop irrigation. In rural villages, long rows of barrels lined homes and animal sheds. In towns, neighbors often shared water systems connecting tin spouts between rooftops or rotating access based on rainfall. Children were tasked with checking levels. Women filtered water by boiling or straining it through tightly woven fabric. Some families added charcoal or ash to help purify the liquid, especially when drinking it became unavoidable. The barrels themselves varied. Older families used oak or pine casks originally meant for wine or pickles. Others adapted military fuel drums, carefully scrubbed and rinsed for civilian use. Leaks were patched with resin, wax, or linen soaked in grease. These were not elegant solutions, but they worked. And when the municipal systems failed, which they often did, these homemade catchments became the only source of liquid life left. Still, rainwater harvesting had limits. A dry month could empty all reserves. Contaminated roofs carried risks. Barrels cracked under neglect. But those who managed their water with care rarely went without. They planned ahead, rationed by need, and never forgot that the sky, though unpredictable, could still be harvested. Could you live off what the clouds gave you, and nothing more? Subscribe to learn the systems that once made survival possible. Number 7, clay pot meat. Smoking refrigeration was a luxury few peasants ever knew. And during war, even that disappeared. Meat, when it could be acquired, had to be preserved immediately, or it would spoil within days. Salt was scarce. Ice was unreliable, so they turned to smoke. In barns, courtyards, and collapsed chimneys, they built low fires from hardwood and used clay pots to trap the smoke, drying meat slowly over hours, sometimes days. This wasn't cooking. It was survival. And the method, though ancient, proved indispensable through every season of the war. The process began with cuts of pork, rabbit, or poultry, often small, bony pieces scavenged or traded. Meat was rubbed with what salt could be spared, or soaked briefly in brine made from boiled-down seawater or vegetable ash. Then it was suspended inside upturned clay pots, old cooking vessels, broken urns, or handmade earthen jars. Beneath them, fires were kindled with applewood, oak, or dried vine, producing dense smoke that clung to the meat and carried its preserving compounds deep into every fiber. The pots acted as mini smokehouses, trapping the heat and smoke while shielding the food from pests, ash, and shifting winds. The fire had to be watched. Too much heat, and the meat cooked too fast, ruining preservation. Too little, and the process failed altogether. Families took turns, rotating shifts through the night to tend coals, add chips, and check consistency. Smoke curled out in slow wisps, through small holes, cut near the base or along the pot's rim. When the process was complete, the meat darkened, hardened, and could be wrapped in cloth or submerged in fat to store for weeks. In colder climates, it lasted even longer. These smoking setups were hidden, not just from weather, but from eyes. In regions where food theft surged, smoking pot was a signal of possession. Some peasants dug pits into the ground to conceal the setup, covering it with branches or boards. Others built stone enclosures with narrow chimneys to direct smoke away from roads. What began as a method of preservation became a quiet act of protection. But it had limits. Smoke couldn't fix bad meat. If the cut was already turning, no fire would save it. Salt remained a weakness. And without it, even smoked meat had to be consumed quickly. Still, for those who mastered the clay pot method, it offered control. A way to stretch one rabbit into a week's worth of meals. A system born from heat, earth, and necessity. Would you trust smoke and clay to guard your food supply? Subscribe. The old ways are waiting. They didn't have options, only outcomes. Survive the season, or vanish in it. These peasants didn't prepare for comfort. They prepped to endure. No electricity, no refrigeration, no second helpings, just rain caught in barrels, crumbs scraped from cloth, and meat dried over embers, while smoke stung their eyes. The genius wasn't in the tools, it was in the discipline, the relentlessness to stretch what they had, and the wisdom to waste nothing. Today, we confuse convenience with readiness. But the old world ran without freezers and plastic, and it fed families through hunger, war, and collapse. Their methods weren't forgotten because they failed. They were forgotten because we got soft. If you feel that edge returning, subscribe. Because one day comfort may end, but knowledge won't. If this video revived even one forgotten method you'd never heard of, don't scroll past it. These weren't trends. They were lifelines. And the world is shifting again. Subscribe now for more wartime survival techniques. Comment which method shocked you most. Save this video. Knowledge fades, but skill remains. Share it with someone who still thinks prepping starts with a credit card. This isn't nostalgia. This is preparation. And we're just getting started.